Hey, sixth graders. I hope that you're all doing well and had a refreshing spring break. I have a new weekly lesson for you guys, and this is one of my favorites. Unfortunately, there's so much to do. It's always hard to choose what to start with. And before we get started, I have two things I want to share with you. First, I have a peanut here that wants to say hi. Can you say hi?
Hi.
And this is Maddie. Okay, Maddie's going to go back by her daddy now. And the other thing I want to share with you is a quote. Every week I would have a quote for you on the wall, and I want to be able to still share that with you. This week's quote is, "Without music, life would be a mistake." And I think that's really important because through all of this, we have music blowing up on Instagram and Twitter and even on TikTok. It's all over the place. So just keep that in mind. All right. So with that being said, this week I want to talk about the 1950s, and this is known as the decade of rock and roll, and it's also the beginning of what we see as the civil rights movement. And you can see on this slide, I have a whole bunch of different groups that you could YouTube if you wanted to, if you're really interested in them. Some of my favorites: Elvis, Johnny Cash, Jerry Lee Lewis, Buddy Holly, Little Richard. There's so many great artists and musicians that come out of this decade that I think it would be worthwhile spending some time to listen to. Okay. And it also fun note is Disney Cinderella came out in the 1950s. Okay. So um, some key points of 1950. It was a decade of prosperity and rock and roll. So prosperity means that lots of great things are happening. Remember, we just talked about World War II, and World War II brought America out of the Great Depression. And after that, we start seeing industries and factories really starting to grow and bloom and flourish, excuse me. And then we also see TV life, screen life starting to blow up as well. We see this picture perfect home life painted with shows like Leave It to Beaver. I bet if you asked your parents about the show Leave It to Beaver, they'd know exactly what you're talking about. But Beaver was this little boy over here, and he always found some mischief to get into, and it was kind of like this picture perfect family that he had. Okay, so though this was the case, there were still many issues. Um, this is where we really start seeing a rise of racial segregation. We see a strong authority from adults and the expectation of conformity. Now that means like everyone is supposed to do the same thing, everyone's supposed to follow the same rules. People were very reserved. No crazy music, no crazy dancing. Um, your clothing should be proper, it shouldn't be torn and tattered, things like that. Okay. So what we have now, I'm going to move myself so you can see this, during this decade is the birth of rock and roll. And rock and roll was really important because it was like the music of the teens, the teenagers, you guys, the tweens in your case. And it really resisted the mainstream values that I just mentioned on the last slide. Many didn't approve of it because it promoted integration of Black ideas into white society. So we see a lot of adults being very upset with the idea of rock and roll because it brought forth um, values that they considered to be associated with African Americans that they didn't want their white children to be doing. And also, a lot of white children, a lot of white teens really liked listening to African American rock and roll music. Okay, so this was music that was made by the teenagers. Excuse me, it says be the teenagers, but it's supposed to be by the teenagers for the teenagers. And the adults had this big fear of their teens becoming juvenile delinquents by listening to this. So they thought that by listening to this music, they were bound for trouble and were going to be doing all kinds of awful things and would end up in jail. Okay, so teens, much like you guys, used music as an outlet for anxiety of pressures of high expectations. So remember, parents really had a lot of pressure on their kids to be like straight A students. They didn't make mistakes. They always went to church. They followed all the rules. And As you guys know, that's a lot of pressure to deal with. So these teens used rock and roll music as an outlet. And this led to a new style of dancing that parents very much frowned upon like shaking their hips, for example. And interestingly enough, you can see some of this in Elvis Presley's videos. If you YouTube some of his early 1950s music videos, he was only recorded kind of like I am right now from like his head on up because his dancing was too sassy, so to speak. And TV stations were wanted to air his music because he was super popular, but they also wanted to please the parents. So that was kind of their compromise. Kind of interesting though, if you think about it compared to now. Okay. The beginning of the civil rights movement. Okay. So, what was the civil rights movement? This is huge. There's a time in our history when African Americans and others fought to have equal rights as white society. This is where Martin Luther King Jr. comes into place. Many marches were held across the country. As African Americans marched, they often sang songs about freedom. These songs were given the title Freedom Songs. Specifically, freedom songs talked about the struggles of life and the hope for change in the future. Many were based off of hymns. Hymns are songs from churches, and they would change the lyrics to fit what they were experiencing. The most well-known freedom song is "We Shall Overcome," and I'll share more with you on that next week when we're talking about the 60s, because we can really see the civil rights movement really grow and continue on into the next decade. Okay, so whoa, I gave you like a super short, brief overview of the 1950s. And when I say there's so much really fun music, it's a ridiculously good amount. So, what I tried to do was to make our weekly check in something that would expose you to a little bit more music. I tried this last week as an option, and not as many people chose it, and I was kind of bummed. So there's only one option this week, and you have to do both parts. The first part is to tell me 2 things you learned about music from the 1950s. Literally go back, pick 2 things that I said, 2 things off of my slides, type them in your own words, and share them with me. Okay. The second part is to listen to the 3 songs that I have from the 1950s and then tell me which one is your favorite. I chose 3 songs that were my favorite that are favorites for different ways and reasons. But the big thing I want to expose you to as you're listening to these is the fact that rock and roll music took traditional music of like the big band era, where traditional instruments like trumpet, saxophone, drum set, sometimes the stand-up bass, which is like a huge, it almost looks like a giant violin where someone stands up. That's called the upright bass. All these different instruments are still used in rock and roll music, but now they start experimenting with how they can change some of the sounds. And we get this really awesome music coming from it. So anyways, listen to the 3 songs. They should all be approved because I approved them as I put them into the doc, and then tell me in the Google Doc which is your most favorite and why. Don't just tell me because it was good. Give me a reason why. Some of them are kind of fun, some of them are kind of silly. So tell me your thoughts on that. In the meantime, I hope it doesn't take you too much time, and I hope that all your other classes are going really well. And I definitely miss you guys and hope to hear from you soon. Miss you, and I wish you guys well. Thanks so much. Bye.